Welcome to Revolutionary War Rarities, the podcast of the Sons of the American Revolution. Like, follow, and subscribe to our podcast in your favorite application. You can also follow our podcast at fastfunhistory.com. For education resources provided by the National Society Sons of the American Revolution, go to education.sar.org. And now, Revolutionary War Rarities.
Hi folks, and welcome back to Revolutionary War Rarities, the podcast from the Sons of the American Revolution. My name is Jim Griffith.
And my name is Jim Maple.
And you know, today, Jim, we are in Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
Yes, we are.
We have been at a national meeting of the Sons of the American Revolution, which occurred here at Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And I'm going to tell what I've been saying the last few times we've recorded here. And that is that Lancaster, Pennsylvania served for one day as the capital of the United States during the American Revolution, and that is because the Second Continental Congress was escaping Philadelphia on their way to York, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And that location that was served as the capital of the United States for that one day is just outside here.
Okay.
We are in the Montgomery House, which was built in 1803, but actually the location for this Montgomery House is in the lobby of the Lancaster Marriott in Penn Square.
Yeah, that's true.
So,
they built the Marriott right around it.
Yep, absolutely. So today's episode is entitled The Death of George Wythe. He is not one of the primary names that we learn about during our studies of American history, but he was a primary contributor to the founding of this nation, George Wythe. If you have spent any time in colonial Williamsburg, you have likely seen his home. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence and helped to define the United States Constitution. He did not sign the Constitution as he had to leave the Constitutional Convention early in order to care for his wife who was dying at that time. He was a professor of law at the College of William and Mary and had notable students with names like Thomas Jefferson and John Marshall. Actually, George Wythe was the first law professor in the United States. Of course, there were other teachers of law that existed before Wythe, but he was the first with the title of professor and taught at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg.
Well, George Wythe was also a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, a judge, and became heavily anti-slavery in his thoughts and actions as time progressed.
In August of 1787, George Wythe's wife passed away. Within 4 days of her death, Wythe filed paperwork to free his maid named Lydia Broadnax. Now, there was another individual who ultimately lived with Broadnax in the home of George Wythe. He was a mixed-race young man named Michael Brown. Of course, this arrangement has led to speculations by some historians that Michael Brown was the child of George Wythe and Lydia Broadnax. However, there is no proof of that.
George Wythe had two older siblings, one brother named Thomas and one sister named Margaret Walker Wythe. George Wythe's sister Margaret had a grandson named George Wythe Sweeney. Well, in 1805, Sweeney came to live with his namesake, great uncle, and the trouble began. Sweeney was only 17 years old, but he had built up some substantial gambling debts, which he was unable to pay, unfortunately.
Well, sadly, Sweeney began to steal from his great-uncle George Wythe. He began selling off his great-uncle's substantial library of books and began forging checks from his great-uncle's personal account.
Okay.
Then on May 25, 1806, George Wythe, Lydia Broadnax, and Michael Brown all became extremely ill.
So, Jim, to recount, Wythe freed his slaves, one of who was his housemaid named Lydia Broadnax, and she was freed upon his wife's death. Lydia continued a very close relationship with Wythe and also brought along with her a mixed-race free man named Michael Brown. George Wythe had his great-nephew living with him, as well as his name, was George Wythe Sweeney. Sweeney had a significant gambling problem and did very little work, so he was basically living off his great uncle. As a result, Sweeney began stealing from his great uncle, and that was discovered by everyone. Now the gig is all but up. Sweeney has been discovered writing forged checks and selling off books. Is that all correct, Jim?
Well, yes, it is. It is correct. Now, here is where the deed is done. Strangely enough, on May 25th, 1806, Wythe, Broadnax, and Brown all became significantly ill. George Wythe claimed to have been poisoned by his great-nephew Sweeney, who it was believed had used arsenic. On June 1st, 1806, Michael Brown died and Sweeney was arrested. George Wythe refused to bail Sweeney out of jail. Ultimately, George Wythe succumbed to his illness on June 8th, 1806. So he died from this illness as well. And I think this story begs some questions as follows. Was Wythe poisoned?
Well, Jim, there is no absolute proof of that. George Wythe certainly believed he had been poisoned and believed that his great nephew was the one who did it. But he did not survive long enough to bring his part of the story into the court of law. Sweeney was ultimately tried for murder but was acquitted. However, the laws of that time would not allow testimony from any black witnesses. Wythe's autopsy never tested for arsenic, and that was a well-known test of that time. Sweeney was convicted of the check forgery, but was ultimately overruled on appeal since the law would not allow forgery to be enforced against a single individual. Instead, it was only issued if it happened against a company or corporation. Rumor has it that Sweeney ultimately ended up in Tennessee and went to jail for stealing a horse, and that is about all we know, Jim, of Sweeney.
Well, was Wythe Michael Brown's father?
Well, Jim, there is no proof of that either, and it wasn't even rumored during that time in history. Over the years, people began asking this question, and as a result of circumstantial evidence, things like, why was Wythe so interested in Brown's education? Wythe had made sure that if he died first, that Thomas Jefferson would continue Brown's education. Why was Brown allowed to live with Wythe? Well, I guess we'll never know. But it does seem odd that Wythe would educate and house someone at no expense unless there was some level of relationship.
So I guess we need to ask, what have we learned from this episode of Revolutionary War Rarities? Well, any way you look at it, George Wythe was a good man, an accomplished man, a founding father, and the first professor of law in the United States. Yes, he was a slave owner, but as slave ownership became more repugnant to him, he proactively freed all of his slaves well before his own death. He risked his life by signing the Declaration of Independence and then lost his life not to the British, but likely to a member of his own family. He served Virginia in the House of Burgesses and was a true mentor and friend to Thomas Jefferson. His substantial library of books was left to Thomas Jefferson in his will, and many of those books ultimately became a part of the start to the Library of Congress. In the end, George Wythe became a memorable part of history, an individual who made a significant difference in the founding of this country and in the lives of the individuals who knew him. Brian Williams is quoted as saying, "You may find that making a difference for others makes the biggest difference in you." And that, my friends, is another Revolutionary War rarity. Like all other episodes, we encourage each of you to dig into the life of George Wythe further, more deeply, by reviewing our show notes. We also want to encourage each of you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Instagram, and become a member of our Facebook group. My name is Jim Griffith.
And my name is Joe Maples. And we thank you for joining us today, and please don't forget to join us again in 2 weeks for the next episode of Revolutionary War Rarities. It's been a production of the National Society, Sons of the American Revolution, www.sar.org.